Hey, I'm Rahul, and I'm a third year PhD student in biomedical engineering. Now, I've done a lot of undergraduate research. I was in actually four different labs as an undergrad. So I have plenty of experience in this space, and I'm making this video to share with you what I learned and tell you how to first get involved with undergraduate research, and two, how to make the most of your experience in a lab. So I'll start by telling you how I got involved with undergraduate research. I started off as actually a biomedical engineering pre-medical student. And I chose it because it was the most broad major that I could choose at the time. Because back in high school, I actually had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I had this broad idea, mostly because my parents wanted me to become a doctor and go to medical school. So I started off by doing the things that I thought I was supposed to do to get into medical school. So that was like shadowing, volunteering, and most importantly, research. Now, I was attending a research institution, so research was always something that I wanted to do, regardless of what career I ended up in. But I didn't exactly know how to get involved. I actually wanted to get involved the second I got to UCI. So my first quarter, I was already thinking about how I would get involved in research. And I was in this program called the campus-wide honors program. And it sounds a lot fancier than it really is. Essentially, you take a few honors classes instead of the regular core undergraduate classes. And you get assigned a mentor who's an honors student, who's an upperclassman, so like a third or fourth year, and they're supposed to help guide you through college throughout your first year. And so I asked him the question, so how do I get involved with undergraduate research? And I mean, he probably must have thought I was like a super gunner type student, but he invited me to attend his lab meeting, and I went to it, and I don't think their lab was actually hiring any undergrads at the time, so I wasn't able to join the lab. But it was cool to see the lab meeting environment, and this actually varies a lot from lab to lab. So I had this idea that, okay, I know I want to do undergraduate research. So what I did was this was kind of like a cold call is what I did. So I emailed every single core professor in biomedical engineering, and I wrote out, hey, my name is Rahul. This is, I'm a first year biomedical engineering student. I read about your research on your website, and, I'm really interested in it for XYZ. I've attached my resume to this email. If you are hiring undergrads, I'd love to set up a meeting with you so that we can discuss opportunities in your lab. Something along those lines. So I sent that email to pretty much every single professor in the department. And honestly, most of them didn't even respond, which you can kind of expect. Something I've learned now is that getting an undergrad is more a function of when a grad student needs an extra hand on a project, more than just providing an opportunity every time an undergraduate wants one. So you kind of have to have good timing with this kind of stuff. But I emailed every single professor. Most of them didn't respond, but some of them responded and said no. And the first professor who responded and said some kind of affirmative or yes, I ended up jumping on the opportunity. So this was a professor at my school, and he essentially asked me to prepare a presentation about a research paper. And this, I think, was my first time reading a research paper in depth. And it was really cool. It was a really cool paper. It was about optogenetics, so how you can use light to manipulate gene expression. It's a very cool paper. I actually was really interested in it, and I made the presentation. Obviously, my skills at presentation and stuff weren't as good back then, but I gave the presentation. It was a lot of fun, and I ended up being accepted into the lab. Now, this was a lab that was very undergraduate heavy. There was one grad student and maybe 5 or 6 different undergrads working for that grad student. And I really liked my lab mates, but progress was super slow. And I actually wouldn't call this like a representative. Actually, who am I to say? But I wouldn't call it, from my experience, a representative like undergraduate research experience. So that was my first involvement with undergraduate research. But actually, as I got more involved in general within like my school community, opportunities would kind of just come out of thin air. It's kind of like crazy how this works. You might call it luck, but really, if you just put yourself out there and start talking to people, especially your professors, if you talk to your professors, opportunities will just come up like nothing. So that's actually how I got my next research opportunity. So I was in this lab for so I sent all these emails in the first quarter of undergrad, and I was in it for 2 quarters, basically the winter and spring of my first year. But in my second year, the first quarter of my second year, I was taking a class, and it was like one of those project-based classes where I had to basically make a kind of a diorama, but it was a coding class. So we had to make like a light show that synchronized with music. And you know how group projects go. I ended up doing the whole project by myself, but right when it was due, my project wasn't working. So at the demo day where all the students present their projects, I was one of the first people to go, and I tried it. My device didn't work. It was super sad and crushing. And the professor saw that, and he saw how much work I'd put into it, because I really genuinely did try my best on it. But he was like, okay, I'll give you until everyone else goes. And if you can figure out what's wrong with your project by the last presentation, then I'll just grade you as if nothing happened. So I did. I locked in, and I figured it out, essentially. And then the professor recognized that, and he invited me to join his lab. Not directly, he actually had a collaborator, and they reached out to me to join that collaboration. And that's actually the lab that I'm in right now doing my PhD in. So obviously, that opportunity was really influential in who I ended up becoming today. So yeah, definitely take initiative in your classes. You have no idea how important that might end up becoming. Even if it's a group project and like you hate your group or whatever, it might end up paying dividends in the future. And the third lab that I actually ended up joining was in the spring quarter of my second year. And this also kind of came out of nowhere. This was in another class that I was taking. The class was actually, I believe it was, the class I was taking was biomechanics. So this was either the end of my second year or the beginning of my third year. And this was actually right in the hit of the COVID pandemic. So actually my research output in the lab that I was in had like really decreased because I wasn't physically in the lab anymore. So I kind of was on the lookout for new opportunities. And one of my professors, because I was doing very well in the class, mentioned in the class that, hey, I'm looking for some students to come help me on this project, on this research project that I am going to start. And turns out I ended up being the only student who emailed about it, which is kind of crazy considering, at least from what I hear, people really want to get involved with research and don't know how to do it. But maybe this was like a rare case. But the professor, she asked for students, and I ended up emailing her from that class. And this lab actually was a virtual reality lab. It was actually very different from anything else I had ever done. And because I was like kind of the first student, I was able to, I don't know if I would recommend this, but I was able to kind of recruit my friends into the same lab too. So it was kind of nice for me and everyone in my friend group to be in the same lab working on the same project. Now, there was some overlap between working in these 3 different labs. However, I would not recommend working in multiple labs at the same time, because the times that I was overlapped were my least productive by far. Um, when you're working on too many different things, your energy gets pulled in different directions and you're not able to focus on a single project and really make a lot of progress. Especially as an undergrad, when you're learning a lot of these things and you don't necessarily know how to do everything that you need to do to succeed, I'd recommend sticking with one lab and really give it your all. And if it's been like a couple quarters and you just don't see the progress happening, then maybe switch to a different lab and then try again, rather than trying to manage two labs at the same time. That's just my 2 cents, because I did do that and it was not productive. Whereas when I was just working in one lab at a time, I was much, much, much more productive, and I was actually able to get something out of my undergraduate research, as opposed to just trying to do the bare minimum for 3 different labs. So now I'll move on. I spent a lot of time talking about how to get involved with research, but now what do you actually do once you're in the lab? Um, because I think getting involved with research is the easy part, but making the most of it is kind of an art in itself. So I'll tell you my experience. In that first lab I joined, so my first ever experience with undergrad research, and my project was to make kind of this synthetic phantom, like a synthetic model of the brain. It was a very simple project. Essentially, I just had to make like a gelatin model with tubes going through to mimic fluid flow within it. And the PhD student was going to use like some ultrasound technique to, study the effect of some treatment on some brain disorders. I don't know if this project ended up going anywhere, but I tried it, but my project was very slow. I definitely, like, my classes were my number one priority, and I was doing like shadowing and volunteering on all this other stuff. And while I kind of just did the bare minimum I needed to do to have something to present at lab meeting every week. And this is a pro that I actually had weekly lab meetings where I had to present to the PI. A lot of the time in a lab, you won't be presenting to the PI. You'll probably just be meeting with a graduate student. But definitely having that recurring meeting like serves as motivation. So if you don't have it, I would encourage you to actually try to set that up with at least a grad student. If you can do it with a professor, that's ideal. But oftentimes they don't have the time for that. So I'd recommend just meeting once a week with the grad student to go over your progress. So I pretty much was just working on this model of the brain, and the progress was so slow. I spent 2 whole quarters making this tiny little, it was like a little box. And it was like 3D printed. It was kind of cool. I liked working on it. But towards the end of that year, the PhD student actually ended up changing her project. And I didn't really have like something to do anymore. It was like completely not even brain related. So I ended up just leaving the lab. Like on good terms and stuff, but yeah, that didn't actually end up working out. The one thing I did several times though in this lab was these things called UROP proposals. It stands for Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. So this is like a program that my school has, and every school has a program like this, where undergraduates can apply to get funding for their undergraduate research. And this opens up pretty much every quarter. And I would write a proposal for it, and I would write like a little budget about all the different things that I would need to do my specific project. And I actually did this almost every single quarter after the first quarter of undergrad. So I did this, like 11 times, which is like kind of a crazy amount actually. But I'm really glad I did it, because like scientific writing is a skill, and writing to get money is another skill, which is super important, especially in academia. And writing in a way to emphasize the impact of your work is super, super, super critical. So I would definitely recommend whatever school you're in to find whatever funding opportunity is and just apply for it. Even if you don't get it, it's a good experience, because the material from that application is going to be used for something else. So that was my experience in that first brain lab. But now I'll move on to the virtual reality lab. I'm going a little bit out of order, but in that virtual reality lab, I was doing really different things. My responsibilities really were to record videos of medical procedures and actually interviews with physicians, and I would stitch these videos in some software called Adobe Premiere, and I would make the videos in virtual reality and test them in virtual reality. And this was like a nice side. It was kind of really more of a side project for me. It was a nice thing to do. I was with my friends. I got to play with some cool VR headsets, but honestly, it was a very low effort experience. But on the flip side, I actually ended up um, being like third author on a conference publication, which was kind of nice. And this really goes to show I spent a lot more effort in that first lab than in the virtual reality lab. But I ended up getting like a publication out of this virtual reality lab. And that really goes to show that like publication output is super nonlinear. So it's not the more work you put in, the more publications you'll get. That's not how it works. There's so many other factors that play into it. It's mostly a function of where in the grad student's timeline you happen to be at. If you're in a stage where the grad student is publishing a lot and just needs a little bit of help, and you can provide that help, that's like the ideal time to join a lab. I know you can't really control this most of the time, but if that is the case, it's the ideal time to join a lab so you can get the most out of it. And you can really see research happening like to completion, which is really nice. But yeah, that virtual reality lab ended up being a pretty low effort experience. And then now I'll go back to my current lab, and actually what I started off doing was I started off just shadowing the grad students, just seeing what he was doing. And this was a very multidisciplinary lab. So there was like cell culture, there was making hydrogels, there was optics, there was electronics, there was making circuits. It was kind of like everything was do it yourself. And it was kind of cool because there were so many different things that I could work on. So when I was an undergrad, I had so many different small projects to just help out the grad student. I ended up like making a circuit for a photodetector. That was a project that ended up going into a publication, which was super nice. So I think it was another second or third author paper to have as an undergrad, which was honestly ended up being really nice to have for applying to grad school. But yeah, it was just these small projects that I had individual autonomy over. And I ended up finding out that like coding was especially MATLAB, coding in MATLAB was something that I was pretty good at from my classes. And it was something that the lab didn't really have any expertise in. But they knew how to do it, but they weren't willing to go above and like to really spend their time on it, which totally makes sense. So what I did was I just started automating all the data analysis pipelines that they had. And this ended up making a huge impact in the lab. And honestly, I still use those codes now when I'm in the lab. So it was pretty nice to be able to, and this is something that I definitely recommend doing, identify what you're good at and where that overlaps with what the lab's needs are. Ideally, the lab has a need at a position or at a skill that you are good at or can get good at. And then that's where you can really provide value to the lab, and that's how you can end up cranking out research output. Yeah, so this research lab ended up being like the most impactful research experience because I got to do so many different things, and I ended up becoming really good friends with the graduate student, which also ended up helping out a lot. And I also had a brief stint in a psychology lab where I analyzed MRI scans, but honestly, I didn't spend enough time in that lab to really talk much about my experience there. This was kind of like right after I graduated, before I ended up starting back at my undergraduate research lab. So I ended up not spending too much time in this lab. So I ended up actually staying in one of the labs that I did undergraduate research in, the one where the professor kind of invited me after I almost failed my project. But if you want to know my reasons for why I ended up choosing a PhD, which was honestly a big part of that is my undergraduate research experience, I have a video about that as well. But good luck to you. I hope you get involved with undergraduate research and make the most of it.